How do you make an alla prima oil painting and not make a mess? This is a question I get asked all the time, and I know a lot of painters find it immensely frustrating to paint wet into wet in oil. So in this video, I'm going to break down the 5 things that may be holding you back from creating the juicy, expressive brushwork you want. So one tricky thing about this painting is that I'm building up the paint layer on the canvas using a lot of dry brushing. Usually what you see me do on this channel is to start with a wash of color on the canvas first, so everything on my canvas is super wet right from the get-go. This can be tricky for a lot of painters as the surface is slick from start to finish, but it has the advantage of not building up a thick paint layer too quickly, as that can easily become unmanageable. Not so with this painting. With this dry brush technique, I'm having to fight a lot of the texture and grip of the canvas first, which is actually by design so that each brush mark carries with it a lot of that canvas texture, and we can have interesting areas of various paint layers showing through or even raw canvas showing through. But the downside is that because I'm not thinning this paint with solvent to start out, my paint is a bit thicker than usual right off the bat. And that brings us to what I want to talk about today: how to paint alla prima or wet on wet with oil paints without making a mess. This is a really common complaint I hear from artists. They'll come to me and complain that they feel like they are ice skating all over the canvas, or that they need to let layers of paint dry before they feel comfortable enough putting down more paint. And if you want to paint alla prima, this is fundamentally incompatible. After all, alla prima painting is about being able to do it in one sitting and not having to let it dry in between layers. It makes sense that this would feel necessary. We want to control our painting, and when your surface is dry and grippy, you can guarantee that your paint stroke won't start blending into the paint beneath it, and you can really feel that sense of control. But you don't need to let your paintings dry in order to get that feeling. And when you don't have to let your paintings dry, you can open yourself up to an entirely new world of mark making and effects that you can achieve with your oil painting. So how can we create wet on wet paintings while maintaining that control? I'm going to break it down into 5 steps. Alright, first things first. Sometimes there's just too much paint to contend with. So in general, no matter which way I'm working, I try to avoid going in with thick paint right off the bat. There's simply too great a chance that any extra paint will get mixed in with later brush strokes and create mud. So I try to reserve thick paint application or heavy impasto until I'm toward the completion of the painting. And when I'm first starting out, I try to keep the paint thin, either by diluting it with solvent or, like I did in this painting, simply avoiding loading out the brush so much that it could go down in a thick or uneven coating. Next, we need to have enough paint. Just like too much paint early on can create a mess, too little paint later in the painting can encourage us to jam our brush into the paint layer that we already have down and mix everything together and make a mess in doing so. And the easiest way we can get into the habit of using too little paint is if we put out too little paint on our palette to begin with. I understand not wanting to be wasteful, especially if you aren't able to get into the studio day after day, but chances are you will waste more paint on paintings that you're frustrated with than you will waste paint sitting on your palette. And I'd much rather we at least have paintings we're proud of if we're going to have materials go to waste. Okay, with that out of the way, let's take a break from talking about paint and instead talk about our brushes. As I have painted more and more, I found that I could more easily reach for any old brush to do the job I'm looking for. Earlier in my painting journey, it felt really important for me to have the right brush for the job. And the number one way to guarantee that I had the right brush for the job was to figure out how the brush wanted to be used, not how I wanted to use it. If you have a wild, grisly, unpredictable mark that you want to make, go ahead and grab a round or filbert brush that has splayed bristles, not your perfectly crisp, squared off, synthetic bright. If you want to learn to apply your paint with a soft touch, which is essential for layering wet on wet paint without making a mess, as we'll discuss later, don't reach for a stiff bristle brush that you can jam into the canvas really easily. Instead, reach for something soft and almost floppy hobby that just won't cooperate if your hand is too heavy. In general, I find some brushes to be ideal for thinner paint, either because it has more solvent or more medium. Paint straight out of the tube can sometimes feel too sticky on these brushes, but stiffer bristle brushes, for instance, can really hold a lot of thick paint well. But the downside is that they can encourage a heavier hand, and they can reinforce a bad habit of having too little paint on the brush and relying on a heavy hand to force that minimal amount of paint from the brush onto the canvas. Which brings me to my next point, which is to make sure you have enough paint on your brush and are thinning it where and how it's appropriate. There's no simple formula for this, and there are a myriad of ways we can work, but in general, I find that I want a certain slipperiness to almost all of my paint mixtures. Most paint straight out of the tube is just too stiff or thick for me personally to work with. Now, on a painting like this one, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to thin this paint down to the point where it's runny, or could cover the canvas like a wash, or not hold any texture. But I've learned that I always need to plan on having some medium on hand for every painting. In my case, I like Rublev's Olia Gel, which is similar to Gamblin's solvent-free gel medium, but honestly, any medium should be able to do the trick. You just want to make sure that you're observing fat over lean and using leaner options like solvent versus fattier options like most mediums when appropriate. And if you aren't sure what that entails, I'll link my video that's all about demystifying how fat over lean works above and in the description. Now, the amount of medium that works for you is probably personal preference, and there is no one formula, but this is something I'd suggest you experiment with. The only thing I will say that no matter what I'm doing after putting down initial wash, if a painting calls for it, is to ensure that I'm never thinning my paint so much that it stops being opaque. I don't work in glazes, so for me it never makes sense to have a mixture that is more translucent medium than it is paint. So for me, my rule of thumb is that I want my paint to feel like it could hold some impasto while still feeling slick. Alright, and finally, we need to talk about the final step, the key ingredient, getting your paint off the brush and onto the canvas without all of your paint mixing together and making a mess. What you want to do is turn your brush on its side to let the paint glide off of the brush instead of pressing hard to force the paint off of the brush. I talk about this in my video on brush handling, which I'll link above as well as in the description if you haven't already checked that out. There I talk about a lot of the same concepts while also showing you what it looks like as I load up the brush and apply the paint. And once you've checked off the steps above and have a feel for your brushes and how much medium you like in your paint mixtures, this is really the step that matters most. Having a light hand with your brush on its side is really the biggest secret I can think of to letting the paint release comfortably and gently enough off your brush that it doesn't disturb the paint underneath and cause it to mix together with the wet paint you already have on your canvas. If you'd like to take this little piece home, or you want to see other pieces I have available, I've included a link to that in the description. And as always, if you found this video helpful, or it was just what you needed to hear today, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon if you haven't already. Until next time, happy painting.